The evening air was crisp, the faint smell of pine and wood smoke mingling with the laughter coming from the Johnson family's yard. Strings of Christmas lights lay coiled at their feet, waiting to be hung. Angela Johnson held up a strand of multicolored bulbs, inspecting them with mock seriousness. "Daniel, these better work. I am not climbing up and down that ladder for half-lit reindeer again." Daniel chuckled, his tall frame bent as he secured an inflatable snowman to the ground. "If they don't, it's because Mia left them tangled all year." "Hey, that's not true," Mia protested, holding a box of ornaments defensively. Angela raised an eyebrow, smiling. "Oh really? Because last year, I distinctly remember untangling this same mess while you mysteriously disappeared with hot cocoa." Mia grinned sheepishly, her cheeks flushing. "Fine, maybe it's a little true." The sound of their laughter carried through the quiet suburban street, blending with the distant hum of Christmas music. Their yard was a cheerful chaos of decorations, a reindeer missing its nose, a slightly lopsided wreath, and a wooden Santa that leaned precariously against the fence. But to the Johnsons, it was perfect. Across the street, Margaret Sullivan stood at her living room window, her lips pursed tightly as she watched the scene unfold. Her home was immaculate, its decorations carefully curated to match her vision of holiday elegance. White lights draped in precise symmetry, a wreath with just the right amount of holly, and a single glowing angel in the center of her lawn. It was, in her opinion, the standard for the neighborhood, and the Johnsons' display a garish insult. Margaret's hand tightened on the curtain as she muttered to herself, "This is supposed to be a respectable neighborhood, not a carnival." She didn't have to watch much longer. With a huff of annoyance, Margaret grabbed her coat, pulled on her boots, and marched outside. The crunch of frost under her heels was sharp and purposeful, echoing like a warning as she crossed the street. "Excuse me," Margaret called, her voice cutting through the Johnsons' laughter. Angela turned, still holding the strand of lights. Daniel straightened, brushing the frost from his gloves. Mia glanced nervously at her parents, the cheerful glow in her eyes dimming. "Yes, Margaret," Daniel said, his tone polite but firm, as if he were addressing a particularly difficult defendant in court. Margaret folded her arms, gesturing at the decorations with a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I couldn't help but notice this." Her gaze swept over the yard, lingering on the inflatable snowman with a look of distaste. "It's a bit much, don't you think?" "It's Christmas," Daniel said evenly. "We're just having some fun." Margaret sniffed. "This neighborhood has standards, Daniel. We take pride in maintaining a certain aesthetic. Perhaps you don't understand that." Angela's fingers tightened on the strand of lights, but she kept her voice calm. "It's not about aesthetics, Margaret. It's about joy. Isn't that what Christmas is supposed to be about?" Margaret's smile sharpened. Joy doesn't have to be loud. She looked at Mia then, her gaze softening in a way that felt patronizing. "I'm sure you mean well, dear, but this isn't the kind of place for this sort of thing." Mia's face flushed, her eyes darting to her parents. Angela stepped forward, placing a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "We've got it under control, Margaret. Thanks for your concern." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, her displeasure obvious. "Just think about what message this sends," she said, turning on her heel. "Good night." The Johnsons watched as she marched back across the street, her pristine lawn glowing under the soft light of her angel display. "She hates us," Mia said quietly, breaking the silence. Daniel placed a hand on her other shoulder, his voice steady and reassuring. "She doesn't hate us. She hates what she can't control." Angela sighed, shaking her head. "Well, she's going to have to get used to it. We're not going anywhere." That night, as the Johnsons slept, Margaret stewed. The nerve of them, flaunting their gaudy decorations in her neighborhood. She couldn't stand it, the way they disrupted her perfect little world, their laughter a grating reminder that she wasn't in control. And so, armed with a pair of scissors and a steely sense of purpose, she stepped into the frosty night. The street was silent, save for the soft crunch of her boots and the occasional rustle of wind. Margaret's movements were swift and deliberate. She cut the strings of lights, watching with grim satisfaction as the bulbs went dark. She slashed at the inflatable snowman, her breath visible in the cold air as she worked. When she was done, she surveyed the destruction with a sense of triumph. Order had been restored. The next morning, Mia's scream shattered the peaceful quiet. "Mom, Dad, come quick." Angela and Daniel rushed outside, their hearts sinking at the sight. The decorations were in ruins, lights severed, the snowman deflated and crumpled, Santa lying face down in the frost. Mia stood in the middle of it all, tears streaming down her face. Why would someone do this? She choked, her voice trembling with hurt. Daniel knelt beside her, his hand on her shoulder as he surveyed the damage. His expression was calm, but Angela knew better. She saw the way his jaw tightened, the storm brewing behind his composed exterior. "We'll fix it," Daniel said quietly. "But what if they do it again?" Mia whispered. "They won't," Angela said firmly, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "We'll make sure of it." As the family worked together to clean up the mess, Daniel glanced across the street. Margaret stood at her window, watching them with a faint smile. She didn't bother to hide. Her message was clear. Daniel's eyes narrowed, his mind already racing. He wasn't just a father cleaning up Christmas decorations. He was a judge, and Margaret had just stepped into his courtroom. "Why do they hate us?" Mia's voice broke the silence in the living room, her words hanging in the air like a delicate ornament about to fall and shatter. She sat cross-legged on the couch, her hands gripping a mug of hot cocoa, her eyes wide and questioning. Angela paused mid-motion, the string of Christmas lights she was untangling slipping from her fingers. Her gaze met Daniel's across the room. His face, usually a fortress of calm, showed the faintest crack of pain. He set down the box of ornaments he was unpacking and walked over, sitting beside Mia. "It's not hate," Daniel said slowly, choosing his words with the precision of a man used to holding people's lives in his hands. "It's fear, fear disguised as hate." Mia frowned, her small hands tightening around the mug. "Why would anyone be afraid of us? We're not scary." Angela set the lights aside and joined them, her arm wrapping protectively around Mia's shoulders. "It's not us they're afraid of, baby. It's what we represent. Change, progress, things they can't control." Mia looked between her parents, her brow furrowed. "But that's not fair. We didn't do anything wrong." "No, we didn't," Angela said softly, stroking Mia's hair. "And that's what makes it so hard. Sometimes, people fear what they don't understand. They see us, our family, our success, and it challenges the way they see the world. Instead of opening their hearts, they build walls." Daniel leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "It's why we moved here, Mia. We wanted you to grow up somewhere safe, somewhere full of opportunities, but we also knew it wouldn't be perfect. There would be people like Margaret." His voice softened, but the steel in it was unmistakable. "What matters is how we respond. Do we let their fear and ignorance stop us, or do we rise above it?" Mia was quiet for a moment, her young mind processing the heavy truth her parents had just handed her. "We rise above it," she said finally, her voice firm despite the tears glistening in her eyes. Angela smiled, pulling her into a tight hug. "That's my girl." As they sat there, bathed in the warm glow of the fireplace, Angela's mind drifted back to the past, back to the battles they'd fought just to get to this moment. She remembered the first time she'd walked into a courtroom as a newly appointed judge, the stares from the attorneys, the barely concealed disbelief from the jury, the whispered comments that she wasn't supposed to hear but did anyway. She's too young. Probably a diversity hire. Let's see how long this lasts. She remembered the way she clenched her fists under the table, the way her heart pounded in her chest as she called the court to order for the first time. And she remembered the moment she proved them wrong, when she delivered a ruling so airtight, so meticulously reasoned, that even her harshest critic couldn't find fault with it. But the victory had been bittersweet, because for every moment of triumph, there were 10 moments of doubt, of frustration, of exhaustion. For every hand extended in support, there were twice as many trying to pull her down. Daniel had faced the same struggles. Even now, as a senior judge known for his fairness and integrity, he still encountered the occasional sneer, the condescending tone from those who couldn't believe a black man could hold such power with such grace. "I never told you this," Angela said suddenly, breaking the silence. Daniel looked at her, his expression curious. "Told me what?" "About the first time I felt like I didn't belong. It was my first week on the bench. An older attorney, he must have been in his 70s, came up to me during a recess and said, 'You've got a lot to prove, young lady. Don't mess it up for the rest of us.'" Her voice wavered slightly, but she kept going. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him that I didn't owe him, or anyone else, an explanation for being there. But instead, I just smiled and said, "Thank you for the advice." And then I went back to work, harder than ever. Daniel nodded slowly. "I've heard versions of that my whole career. It never stops, does it?" Angela shook her head. "No, it doesn't. But we keep going, because it's bigger than us. It's for her." She looked down at Mia, who had fallen asleep in her arms, her small face peaceful despite the weight of their conversation. Daniel reached out, his hand covering Angela's. "And because we deserve to be here, we've earned it." Across the street, Margaret sat in her pristine living room, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands. She stared out the window at the faint glow of the Johnsons' Christmas tree, her jaw tight. Her friend Karen sat across from her, scrolling through her phone. "You're really worked up over those new neighbors, aren't you?" Margaret didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was clipped. "They're ruining the neighborhood." Karen raised an eyebrow, her tone light but probing. "Ruining it how, exactly? Their house is beautiful. Their yard is always immaculate. And Mia is a sweet kid." Margaret's lips thinned. "It's not about their yard, Karen. It's about standards. This neighborhood has a certain character, a certain history, and they don't fit." Karen leaned back, crossing her arms. "You mean they're black?" Margaret stiffened, her cheeks flushing. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." Karen's voice softened, but her gaze was unflinching. "Look, I know you've had a tough time since Richard passed, but maybe it's time to let go of this need to control everything. The neighborhood isn't yours to run." Margaret's hand tightened around her teacup, the ceramic cool against her skin. "I'm just trying to protect what we've built." Karen sighed, standing and gathering her coat. "What you've built, Margaret, is a wall. And sooner or later, someone's going to knock it down." As Karen left, Margaret sat alone in the darkened room, her thoughts churning. She wasn't ready to admit it, not to herself, not to anyone, but Karen's words had struck a nerve. The Johnsons and Margaret were on a collision course, their lives bound together by a conflict rooted in fear, pride, and the possibility of change. Neither side could yet see the road ahead, but one thing was certain. It would force them all to confront truths they'd long avoided, and nothing would ever be the same. The morning frost still clung to the edges of the grass as Daniel knocked firmly on Margaret's door. His breath formed small clouds in the cold air, but his expression was warm steel, controlled, but unyielding. Angela had suggested waiting until after the weekend, but Daniel knew this couldn't wait. Mia's tear-streaked face, the wreckage of their decorations, it all replayed in his mind, demanding action. The sound of footsteps approached, sharp and deliberate, until the door swung open. Margaret stood there, dressed impeccably in a beige cardigan, her lips pressed into a tight line. She didn't bother with a greeting. "Yes." "Morning, Margaret," Daniel said evenly. "I thought we should talk." He held up his phone, its screen glowing faintly. On it, a still image from the Johnson security camera showed a figure, bundled in a coat, slicing through Christmas lights. The person's face wasn't fully visible, but the outline was unmistakable. Margaret's eyes flicked to the screen before narrowing. "I don't know what you're trying to accuse me of, but that could be anyone." Her tone was icy, dismissive, but a flicker of something passed across her face. Surprise, maybe, or a crack in her confidence. Daniel didn't blink. "We both know it isn't just anyone. It's you, Margaret." Her laugh was sharp, bitter. "Prove it." "Margaret," Daniel said, his voice calm but firm, "this isn't about proving anything. It's about accountability. You didn't just destroy lights and decorations. You took away my daughter's joy, her sense of safety. And you did it because you don't think we belong here." Margaret's expression hardened. "You're imagining things. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I suggest you drop it. You have no proof, and frankly, your accusations are insulting." Daniel held her gaze, his own unflinching. "This isn't a game, Margaret. It's our lives. We moved here because we believed in this community, and whether you like it or not, we're part of it now." He stepped back, his voice steady. "This isn't over." Margaret didn't respond. She simply closed the door with a force that rattled the frame. By the time Daniel returned home, Margaret was already at work. She made phone calls, sent emails, and planted the seeds of doubt among her network of allies in the neighborhood. Over cups of coffee and thinly veiled smiles, she whispered her version of events, twisting the story, painting the Johnsons as outsiders who didn't respect the neighborhood's values. "They think they're above the rules," she told Mrs. Grant, who nodded hesitantly. "Judges, of all things. Isn't that rich? They're used to being in charge. They think they can just come here and do whatever they want." Not everyone believed her. Some neighbors, like the Petersons, saw through Margaret's manipulation. They quietly voiced their support to the Johnsons, but stopped short of taking a stand. Fear of retaliation, of becoming Margaret's next target, kept them silent. The effects were immediate. At the grocery store, Angela noticed familiar faces avoiding her aisle. Daniel's usual morning greetings on his jog were met with hesitant nods or cold indifference. The warmth they'd started to feel in the community was replaced by an icy distance. The tension seeped into their home. One evening, as Angela prepared dinner, she noticed Mia sitting at the kitchen table, unusually quiet. Her head was bent over her homework, but her pencil barely moved. "Mia," Angela said gently, setting down the knife she'd been using. "What's wrong?" Mia hesitated, her fingers tightening around the pencil. Finally, she looked up, her eyes filled with tears. "It's Jacob," she said softly. Jacob was Margaret's grandson, a boy in Mia's class at school. Angela knelt beside her, her heart already breaking. "What about Jacob?" He said we don't belong here," Mia whispered, her voice trembling. "He said his grandma told him people like us ruin neighborhoods." Angela's chest tightened, the words like a punch to her gut. She pulled Mia into a hug, her hand stroking her back. "Oh, sweetheart," she murmured. Daniel walked in then, setting down his briefcase as he took in the scene. His brow furrowed. "What happened?" Angela explained quietly, her voice taut with anger and sorrow. Daniel's face darkened, his jaw tightening as he listened. Mia pulled back, wiping her tears. Why do they hate us? Daniel knelt beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. They don't hate us, Mia, he said firmly. They hate what they don't understand. But you listen to me. What Jacob said doesn't define you. You are kind, smart, and strong, and you have just as much right to be here as anyone else. Angela chimed in, her voice steady. We're not going to let their ignorance take away our happiness. Do you hear me? We're stronger than that. Mia nodded slowly, though the hurt lingered in her eyes. That night, after Mia had gone to bed, Daniel and Angela sat together in the living room, the weight of the day pressing down on them. Angela broke the silence first. We can't let this continue. Daniel nodded. I know. This isn't just about us anymore. It's about every family who's ever been pushed out or made to feel unwelcome because they didn't fit someone else's idea of acceptable. He looked at her, his eyes filled with quiet determination. We have to fight, not just for us, but for everyone. Angela reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. Then, let's fight. Across the street, Margaret sat in her living room, sipping tea and staring out the window at the Johnsons' darkened house. She felt a flicker of satisfaction, but it was fleeting. The Johnsons hadn't left, hadn't backed down, and deep down, she knew they wouldn't. The battle lines had been drawn, and the storm was only beginning. Angela sat at the dining room table late into the night, her laptop casting a pale glow over her determined face. The soft click of keys echoed in the otherwise quiet house. Daniel had long since gone to bed, but Angela couldn't stop. Every piece of information she uncovered felt like another piece of a puzzle that had to be solved. She wasn't just angry anymore, she was determined. Margaret Sullivan wasn't an anomaly. She wasn't some lonely widow acting out in grief. She was calculated, intentional, and Angela was going to prove it. She leaned back, rubbing her eyes before scrolling to another page. HOA newsletters, meeting minutes, neighborhood social groups. Angela dug through every public record she could find. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge, a trail of discord that always seemed to lead back to Margaret. Families had come and gone in the neighborhood over the years, but it wasn't random. The Jones family in 2017, the Rodriguezes in 2019. Both families had left within months of moving in, citing reasons that Angela could now see were suspiciously vague. Job transfer and personal reasons were common refrains, but now she knew better. Angela clicked on a thread from the neighborhood forum, a digital space Margaret often dominated. She found a comment from years ago, written by someone named Clara Pierce. We just want to be left alone, but she won't stop. Every week, it's a new complaint, a new reason why we're not fit for the neighborhood. My kids are scared to play outside. The post had been buried, its replies filled with dismissive comments and Margaret's defensive tone. If you follow the rules, there's nothing to be afraid of, Margaret had written. Angela's fingers hovered over the trackpad, her mind racing. She didn't know Clara, but she felt the weight of her words. How many families had been bullied into leaving? How many had endured what the Johnsons were now facing? The sound of creaking floorboards startled her. She turned to see Daniel standing in the doorway, his arms crossed, his expression a mix of exhaustion and concern. Angela, he said softly, it's almost 2 a.m. I'm onto something, Danielle, she replied, her voice tinged with urgency. This isn't just about us. Margaret's been doing this for years. She's targeted families like ours, and driven them out, and she's using the HOA to do it. Danielle walked over, pulling out a chair and sitting beside her. What do you mean? Angela turned the laptop toward him, scrolling through the records she compiled. Look at this. Complaints filed against the Rodriguezes. Noise violations, parking issues, yard maintenance. Every little thing they did, she turned into a problem. And then there's this. She pointed to an email thread she'd found. Margaret's been manipulating the HOA. She's got half the board wrapped around her finger. They don't even question her anymore. Daniel's jaw tightened as he read, and the Rodriguezes left because of this. Angela nodded. Them, and the Joneses before them. I think there are more, but I haven't found all the details yet. Margaret doesn't just dislike us, Daniel. She's made it her mission to control who stays in this neighborhood. Daniel leaned back, his hands clasped tightly together. She's running the HOA like a personal fiefdom. Exactly, Angela said, and I think she's hiding something. Financial records don't add up. I've found discrepancies in the meeting minutes, vague budget allocations that don't make sense. Margaret's not just a bully, she's covering her tracks. Daniel nodded slowly, his mind already working. If she's abusing her power, we'll expose her, but we need more than suspicion. We need proof. The next day, Daniel began his own investigation. He reached out to neighbors, carefully choosing his words to gauge their responses. Some were hesitant, their voices dropping to whispers when he mentioned Margaret's name. Others were more forthcoming, their frustration bubbling over as they recounted years of passive-aggressive emails, unexpected fines, and veiled threats. She made my life a living hell, one neighbor, Mrs. Carter, admitted over coffee. My husband wanted to fight back, but I just wanted peace. So we stopped using the fire pit, stopped parking in front of the house, anything to avoid her attention. Did she ever target anyone else? Daniel asked. Mrs. Carter hesitated before nodding. The Rodriguezes, the Ngoyans, anyone who didn't fit her vision. She called it preserving the neighborhood's charm. I call it what it is, prejudice. Back at home, Angela sifted through more financial records. The HOA's budget was meticulous on paper, but she noticed a recurring expense labeled Neighborhood Beautification Fund. It accounted for thousands of dollars annually, yet there were no specific projects or invoices attached. Daniel, she called, waving him over. Look at this. She's funneling money somewhere. I don't know where yet, but it's shady. Daniel studied the screen, his expression darkening. If she's mismanaging funds, that's not just unethical, it's illegal. We can bring this to the HOA board, but we need to be strategic. If we go in guns blazing, she'll use her connections to shut us down. Angela nodded. We need allies. People who are tired of her nonsense, but too scared to speak up. If we can show them the truth, they'll stand with us. Over the next week, Daniel and Angela worked tirelessly, compiling evidence and reaching out to neighbors. Slowly, they began to build a coalition, quiet at first, but growing louder as more people came forward. I've been waiting for someone to stand up to her, one neighbor admitted during a late-night meeting at the Johnsons' home. She's been a tyrant for too long. Meanwhile, Margaret began to sense the shift in the air. She noticed neighbors whispering in corners, their eyes darting toward her. She heard the faint edge of defiance in their voices during HOA meetings. For the first time, her grip on the neighborhood felt tenuous, and it infuriated her. Who do they think they are? She muttered to herself one evening, pacing her living room. Her pristine world was unraveling, and she knew exactly who was to blame. But what Margaret didn't know was that the Johnsons had uncovered her Achilles heel. Buried in the financial records was a trail of personal expenses disguised as HOA business, landscaping services for her property, catering for private events, even a vacation labeled as a leadership retreat. Daniel looked at Angela, the weight of their discovery settling between them. She's been stealing from the HOA. Angela nodded, her resolve hardening. And we're going to make sure everyone knows it. The Johnsons had their proof, but the battle was far from over. As they prepared to confront Margaret, they knew she wouldn't go down without a fight. The stage was set for a showdown that would determine not just their family's future, but the soul of the neighborhood itself. The Johnson family's house glowed like a beacon, its warm lights and festive decorations drawing the eye against the crisp, dark evening. Tables lined the driveway, piled high with cookies, hot cocoa, and bowls of hearty chili. A soft hum of holiday music drifted from a portable speaker, the cheerful tunes mingling with the sound of laughter. Angela adjusted a string of twinkling lights, her gaze flicking nervously toward the street. "Do you think they'll come?" she asked, her voice low, but the edge of worry was clear. Daniel placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "They'll come," he said firmly, though the flicker of doubt in his eyes betrayed him. Across the yard, Mia arranged chairs around the fire pit, her determination shining brighter than the flames crackling nearby. The block party wasn't just a gesture of goodwill, it was a statement. After weeks of whispers, sideways glances, and thinly veiled hostility, the Johnsons were determined to show their neighbors who they truly were. This was more than an event. It was an invitation, a bridge they were building despite the odds. But in the house across the street, Margaret Sullivan sat in her immaculate living room, her lips pressed into a thin line. From her window, she could see the Johnsons bustling about, their yard alive with light and laughter. It made her stomach twist. "They think they can just take over," she muttered, sipping her tea. Her friend Lydia sat on the couch, clearly uncomfortable but unable to escape Margaret's pointed monologue. "It's just a party, Margaret," Lydia offered weakly. "Maybe it's their way of making peace." "Peace," Margaret spat, setting her cup down with a clatter. "They're trying to turn this neighborhood into a circus. And if they think I'm going to stand by and let it happen, they're sorely mistaken." She pulled out her phone and began typing furiously into the neighborhood group chat. Her fingers flew across the screen, the messages sharp and decisive. "Let's remind everyone what this neighborhood stands for. Don't support this mockery." The messages spread quickly, her allies chiming in with agreements. But there were others, neighbors who read Margaret's words and hesitated. The Petersons exchanged a look, their young children peeking out the window at the glow of the Johnsons' yard. "Maybe we should go," Mrs. Peterson said softly. "It looks nice." Her husband frowned. "Margaret won't like it." "Since when do we let Margaret decide how we live our lives?" Mrs. Peterson shot back. For the first time, she opened the door, bundled the kids in coats, and stepped outside. One by one, neighbors began to trickle in. First the Petersons, then the Nguyen's, followed by the Carters. Each arrival filled the Johnsons' yard with more laughter, more warmth. Angela greeted everyone with a bright smile, her heart swelling with hope as the crowd grew. Daniel manned the grill, flipping burgers and exchanging easy banter with neighbors who had once avoided him. Mia stood near the fire pit, her hands clasped nervously as she looked at the gathering crowd. When Daniel caught her eye, he gave her an encouraging nod. Taking a deep breath, she stepped onto the small makeshift stage her parents had set up, a platform of crates decorated with garlands and lights. "Excuse me, everyone," Mia called out, her voice trembling slightly but gaining strength as the crowd quieted. "I just wanted to say something." All eyes turned to her. From across the street, Margaret watched through her window, her grip tightening on the curtain. Mia's voice was steady now, her words clear and heartfelt. "When we moved here, we thought this neighborhood was perfect. The houses, the parks, the decorations, it all looked like something out of a storybook. But what really makes a neighborhood isn't what it looks like. It's the people. It's how we treat each other." The crowd murmured in agreement, the warmth in their eyes encouraging her to continue. "Not everyone's been kind to us," Mia said, her voice cracking slightly. "But my parents taught me that kindness is stronger than hate. That community is built by working together, not tearing each other down. So tonight, we just wanted to say, we're here to be part of this neighborhood, not to change it. We're here to add to it, to make it even better." Applause erupted, the sound carrying through the crisp night air. Daniel felt a swell of pride as he watched his daughter, her face glowing with courage. Angela wiped a tear from her cheek, her heart brimming with love. But not everyone was moved. Across the street, Margaret turned away from the window, her face twisted in fury. "This isn't over," she hissed under her breath. The next morning, the first letter arrived. It was official looking, with the HOA logo stamped prominently at the top. Angela opened it at the breakfast table, her brow furrowing as she read. "Violation notice," she said aloud. "Improper use of yard space." Daniel took the letter, his eyes scanning it quickly. "She's retaliating," he said flatly. Angela sighed, setting down her coffee. She can't stand that the party was a success. More letters followed, noise complaints, parking violations, accusations of improper decorations. Each one was signed by the HOA, but it was clear who was behind them. Margaret was using the same tactics she'd employed for years, weaponizing the HOA to maintain her control. Daniel and Angela weren't surprised, but they were prepared. At the next HOA meeting, they arrived armed with evidence. The room was packed, the tension palpable. Margaret sat at the head of the table, her expression smug, but there was a flicker of unease in her eyes as the Johnsons walked in. Daniel stood, his voice calm but commanding. "We've received multiple violation notices over the past week, all of them unfounded, and all of them signed off by the HOA president, Margaret Sullivan." Margaret's smile didn't falter. "If you followed the guidelines, there wouldn't be any issues," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. Angela stepped forward, holding up a stack of papers. "These are the HOA guidelines. We've reviewed them thoroughly, and not one of the notices aligns with the rules, but that's not surprising, given Margaret's history." The room murmured, neighbors exchanging glances. Daniel's voice sharpened, cutting through the noise. "Over the past 5 years, Margaret has used this HOA to target families she deems unworthy of this neighborhood. She's filed false complaints, manipulated board members, and mismanaged funds. And we have proof." He handed the documents to a stunned board member, who began flipping through them, his expression growing darker with each page. Margaret's composure cracked. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "They're just trying to smear my name because they can't handle following the rules." "No, Margaret," Angela said, her voice steady and strong. "We're standing up to a bully, and we're not alone." Neighbors began to speak up, their voices rising in support. "She fined us for planting the wrong flowers," one said. "She made us repaint our fence 3 times," another added. Margaret's face turned red, her words faltering as the tide turned against her. By the end of the meeting, the board had voted to remove Margaret from her position. As she stormed out of the room, Daniel and Angela exchanged a look, one of quiet victory. But they knew this wasn't just about Margaret. It was about reclaiming their neighborhood, about creating a space where everyone could feel welcome. As they walked home that night, hand in hand, Angela looked up at the stars, a smile spreading across her face. "This is just the beginning," she said softly. Daniel nodded, "And it's a good one." The HOA meeting room buzzed with anticipation, the kind of charged energy that could only come from weeks of pent-up frustration. Neighbors filled the seats and stood along the walls, whispering in hushed tones that grew louder whenever someone glanced at Margaret Sullivan. She sat at the head of the long table, her posture rigid, her perfectly coiffed hair as sharp as the tight line of her mouth. Her eyes flicked toward Daniel and Angela Johnson, who sat across from her with calm but unyielding expressions. "Let's bring this meeting to order," Margaret snapped, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. She banged the gavel with unnecessary force, making a few people jump. "We have a packed agenda tonight, so let's get on with it." Daniel rose from his chair slowly, his movements deliberate. He adjusted his suit jacket, letting the room settle into silence as all eyes turned to him. Angela sat beside him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her calm demeanor masking the storm of emotions she felt. "Before we begin," Daniel said, his voice steady but commanding, "I have some urgent matters to address regarding the governance of this HOA." Margaret leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing. "If this is another one of your baseless complaints—" "It's not baseless," Daniel interrupted, his voice firm. He held up a folder thick with documents. "These are records, HOA financial statements, meeting minutes, and testimonies from residents, detailing a pattern of misconduct that has gone unchecked for far too long." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over the crowd. Margaret's jaw tightened, but she forced a smile. "Oh please," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "This is clearly an attempt to discredit me. I've done nothing but serve this community faithfully for years." "Faithfully," Daniel repeated, his voice sharp. He stepped closer to the table, his presence filling the room. "Is it faithful to misuse HOA funds for personal expenses? To weaponize this board against families you deem unworthy? To drive neighbors out of their homes with harassment and false accusations?" A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of shock and recognition. Mrs. Carter, who had been sitting quietly in the back, raised her hand. "I remember when she fined us for having the wrong shade of paint on our shutters," she said, her voice trembling. "We had to pay hundreds to repaint them, even though they matched the guidelines." Margaret's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. "That was about maintaining the aesthetic of the neighborhood," she said. "No, it wasn't," Angela interjected, her voice clear and steady. She stood, her eyes locking onto Margaret's. "It was about control. And it's not just the Carters. The Rodriguezes, the Nguyen's, the Joneses, all of them left this neighborhood because of your actions." Margaret's cheeks flushed, her voice rising defensively. "I was enforcing the rules. That's my job as president of this HOA." Daniel held up a page from the folder, his expression unyielding. "And was it your job to use HOA funds to hire a private landscaper for your property? To pay for catering at your personal events? To label a family's holiday decorations as public nuisances simply because you didn't like them?" The crowd erupted in whispers and gasps, the tension in the room growing with every word. Margaret's carefully constructed facade was crumbling, and she knew it. "That's enough," she snapped, her voice shaking. "This is a smear campaign, and I won't stand for it." Daniel didn't flinch. "The records speak for themselves, Margaret, and so do the neighbors you've silenced and intimidated over the years." He gestured toward the back of the room, where Clara Pierce, a former resident, stood. She stepped forward hesitantly, clutching a small stack of papers. "I didn't think I'd ever come back here," Clara said, her voice quiet but steady. "But when the Johnsons reached out to me, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore." Margaret's face paled as Clara handed the papers to the board members. "These are emails from Margaret," Clara explained, "threatening fines, sending warnings about supposed violations, all designed to make me and my family feel unwelcome. We couldn't take it anymore, so we left." The room was electric, the neighbors shifting in their seats as they pieced together the full picture. Margaret's grip on the room was slipping, and she could feel it. "This is absurd," she shouted, rising from her chair. "Everything I've done has been for the good of this community, to preserve its character and reputation." Daniel turned to face her fully, his voice calm but laced with steel. And what exactly do you mean by character, Margaret? By reputation? Because from where I stand, it looks like you've used those words to justify discrimination and exclusion." Margaret's eyes darted around the room, searching for support, but the faces that had once nodded along with her were now filled with doubt, or worse, anger. "This neighborhood is better because of me," she yelled, her voice cracking. "I've kept it safe, clean, respectable." "Respectable," Angela cut in, her voice rising. "What you've done isn't respectable, Margaret. It's cruel, and it's over." The crowd erupted into applause, the sound deafening in the small room. Margaret's face twisted with fury, but she couldn't fight the tide. The board members huddled together, their expressions grim as they reviewed the evidence. Finally, Mr. Peterson, the board's treasurer, stood. His voice was measured but resolute. "The evidence presented here tonight is clear. Margaret Sullivan has violated the bylaws of this HOA and abused her position for personal gain. Effective immediately, she is removed as president of the board." The room broke into cheers, the neighbors standing and clapping as Margaret sank back into her chair, stunned. She looked around, her mouth opening and closing, as if searching for the right words, but nothing came. "You can't do this to me," she finally said, her voice small and desperate. "I built this neighborhood." "No, Margaret," Daniel said, his voice firm but not unkind. "This neighborhood was built by the people in it. The families, the friendships, the kindness. And it's stronger without fear and hate." Margaret stood abruptly, grabbing her purse and storming toward the door. The crowd parted to let her through, their silence deafening. As she reached the exit, she turned back, her face a mask of anger and humiliation, but no one met her gaze. As the door slammed shut behind her, the room seemed to exhale collectively. Neighbors turned to each other, their expressions filled with relief and newfound hope. Angela looked at Daniel, a small smile breaking through her composed exterior. "We did it," she said softly. "No," Daniel replied, his voice filled with quiet pride as he looked around the room. "We all did." The meeting ended with a sense of renewal, the neighborhood beginning to heal from years of division. But as Daniel and Angela walked home that night, they knew this was only the beginning of something bigger. The true work of rebuilding trust and community lay ahead, and they were ready to face it together. The hum of conversation and soft laughter filled the Johnsons' backyard as neighbors gathered under the glow of string lights. It had been weeks since the dramatic HOA meeting, and the air felt lighter, freer. Daniel stood by the grill, flipping burgers and chatting with Mr. Peterson, who now wore an easy smile instead of the guarded look he'd had before. Angela moved through the crowd, her warmth drawing people in. She carried a tray of lemonade, pausing to laugh with Mrs. Carter, whose shoulders seemed less hunched without Margaret's shadow looming over her. Even Mia was a whirlwind of joy, running between the tables, laughing with the other kids. "This is what I always hoped for," Angela said softly as she stopped by Daniel's side, her eyes scanning the scene. Daniel nodded, his gaze fixed on their daughter. "It's amazing what happens when people stop living in fear." The block party was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, the neighborhood transformed. Gone were the whispered complaints and wary glances. In their place came shared meals, group walks, and children playing together in the street. The Johnsons worked tirelessly to foster the sense of unity they dreamed of, organizing community events and proposing changes to the HOA that prioritized inclusion over control. "It's like the whole neighborhood is waking up," Mrs. Peterson said one evening during a community cleanup day. She leaned on her rake, watching as kids worked together to plant flowers around the park. "I didn't realize how much Margaret's rules had stifled us until now." Angela smiled but didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The sight before them was answer enough. Margaret, however, was nowhere to be seen. She kept to herself in the days after the meeting, her once pristine lawn now looking slightly unkempt, her windows closed tight. Neighbors who had once sought her approval now avoided her, their smiles turning into awkward nods if they passed her on the sidewalk. But Margaret wasn't oblivious to the shift. She heard the laughter coming from the Johnsons' yard, saw the families gathering without her. Her isolation was a bitter pill to swallow, but it was the cracks forming in her carefully constructed identity that hurt the most. One afternoon, as she stared out her window at the bustling street, Margaret found herself clutching the edge of her kitchen counter. Her hands trembled, not with anger, but with something she hadn't felt in years: shame. Her doorbell rang, jolting her from her thoughts. She opened it cautiously, her heart sinking when she saw Angela standing there, holding a small plate of cookies. "Good afternoon, Margaret," Angela said warmly. Margaret blinked, confused. "Angela." Her voice was stiff, unsure. Angela extended the plate. "I thought you might like these. Mia and I baked them this morning." Margaret hesitated, her pride and her loneliness warring inside her. Finally, she reached out, taking the plate. "Thank you," she said quietly. Angela gave her a small smile. "We'll see you around," she said before turning and walking back across the street. Margaret closed the door, staring down at the cookies as if they were something foreign. Her chest felt tight, and for the first time, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, she'd gotten it all wrong. The next day, Margaret did something she hadn't done in years. She left her house to join the neighbors. It wasn't much, just a few words exchanged with Mrs. Carter as they both watered their lawns, but it was a start. Over the following weeks, she began to appear more often, her stiff demeanor softening little by little. It was a quiet evening when Margaret finally worked up the courage to approach the Johnsons' door. She clutched a small envelope in her hands, her heart pounding as she rang the bell. Angela opened it, her eyes widening slightly in surprise. "Margaret," she said, her voice calm but curious. I wanted to say something," Margaret began, her voice faltering. She held out the envelope. "This is for you." Angela took it carefully, glancing at Daniel as he stepped into the doorway beside her. Margaret's gaze dropped to the ground. "I've spent a lot of time thinking about everything that happened, about what I've done. I know I can't take it back, but I'm sorry. For the decorations, for the letters, for all of it." Angela and Daniel exchanged a look, the weight of her words sinking in. "I don't expect forgiveness," Margaret continued, her voice cracking, "but I needed to say it, and I want to do better." Angela's expression softened. "Thank you, Margaret," she said gently. "Change isn't easy, but it's worth it." Margaret nodded, her eyes glistening. She turned to leave, but Daniel stopped her with a quiet, "Margaret." She turned back, her breath catching. "You're welcome to join us anytime," Daniel said, his voice steady and sincere. Margaret blinked, stunned. Then, with a small, shaky smile, she nodded and walked away. The neighborhood continued to grow stronger, its people coming together in ways they never had before. And while Margaret's journey was far from complete, she was taking steps, tentative, halting steps, toward being the person she wished she'd been all along. 1 year later, the Johnsons stood on their lawn, putting the finishing touches on their Christmas decorations. This time, the entire neighborhood had joined in, their houses glowing with lights and laughter. Margaret stood at the edge of the yard, clutching a plate of cookies. Her steps were hesitant, but when Mia saw her, she ran over with a bright smile. "Hi, Mrs. Sullivan." Margaret's heart swelled at the simple kindness in the girl's voice. "Hello, Mia," she said softly. As Margaret handed the cookies to Angela, she looked around at the scene, the families mingling, the kids laughing, the joy that filled the air. For the first time, she didn't feel like an outsider. Daniel caught her eye and gave her a nod, one that spoke of understanding and possibility. Margaret nodded back, her chest feeling lighter than it had in years. As the first snowflakes began to fall, the neighborhood stood together, a community united not by perfection, but by the willingness to grow, to forgive, and to create something better. Mia's voice trembled as she stepped onto the stage, clutching a small stack of note cards. The school auditorium was packed. Students, teachers, and parents filled every seat. The bright stage lights made it hard to see beyond the first row, but she knew her family was there, sitting in the center. Daniel and Angela smiled up at her, their warmth and pride radiating like a lighthouse in a sea of nerves. She cleared her throat, gripping the edges of the podium. "Hi, everyone," she began, her voice shaky but clear. "I'm Mia Johnson, and today I want to share a story about my family. It's about kindness, courage, and how even in the hardest times, we can make a difference." The room grew still, the usual restless shuffling of middle school students giving way to silence. Mia looked down at her cards, then back up, her confidence growing with each word. "When we first moved into our neighborhood, we thought it was perfect. It had parks, nice houses, and lots of kids, but not everyone was happy to see us. Some people thought we didn't belong." A ripple of surprise passed through the room. A few students whispered to each other, their voices quickly shushed by the teachers. "One of our neighbors didn't just dislike us," Mia continued. "She went out of her way to make us feel unwelcome. She destroyed our Christmas decorations. She spread lies about us. She even tried to get us kicked out of the neighborhood." A murmur spread through the audience, louder this time. Mia paused, taking a deep breath as she glanced toward her parents. Daniel gave her an encouraging nod, and Angela mouthed, "You've got this." "But my parents didn't let her win," Mia said, her voice steady now. "They stood up for what was right, not just for us, but for everyone who had ever felt like they didn't belong. They showed me that courage doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what's right, even when it's hard." She held up one of the note cards, her fingers no longer trembling, and something amazing happened. The people in our neighborhood started to see the truth. They realized that the things that make us different are the things that make us stronger. And now, our neighborhood is full of love and kindness. Even the person who hurt us the most is trying to change. The crowd erupted into applause, some students cheering, others wiping their eyes. Mia beamed, stepping back from the podium. As she walked off the stage, her heart felt like it might burst. Her parents stood and clapped, their pride unmistakable. When they got home that evening, the Johnsons' house glowed in the soft light of their Christmas decorations. This year, the display was bigger, brighter, and more joyful than ever. Lights framed every window, reindeer stood tall on the lawn, and a massive inflatable snowman greeted passersby with a cheerful wave. Neighbors strolled by, pausing to admire the scene. Some even stopped to chat with Daniel and Angela, sharing holiday greetings and plans for the upcoming block party. It was a stark contrast to the tension of the previous year. "Looks like the whole neighborhood's in the spirit," Angela said, sipping a mug of hot cocoa as she watched Mia run toward a group of kids playing tag on the sidewalk. Daniel stood beside her, his arm draped around her shoulders. It's amazing what a little truth and a lot of patience can do. The annual block party was bigger than ever, a true celebration of the community's transformation. Tables lined the street, covered with food, drinks, and desserts contributed by every family. Laughter filled the air, mingling with the sound of holiday music playing from a portable speaker. Angela greeted guests with her usual warmth, her hands filled with plates of cookies and cups of cider. Daniel manned the grill, flipping burgers and chatting with Mr. Nguyen, who laughed at one of Daniel's jokes about the struggles of assembling Christmas decorations. And then, quietly, Margaret arrived. She stood at the edge of the yard, clutching a plate of cookies, her posture hesitant. The once proud woman, who had commanded the neighborhood with an iron fist, now looked unsure, almost vulnerable. For a moment, she seemed ready to turn around and leave, but then Mia spotted her. "Hi, Mrs. Sullivan," Mia called out, waving with the enthusiasm only a child could muster. Margaret blinked, caught off guard. Slowly, she smiled, a small, tentative smile, and walked toward the group. Angela noticed her approach and met her halfway. "Margaret," she said warmly, "it's good to see you." Margaret hesitated, then held out the plate of cookies. I thought I'd bring these. As a thank you. For everything." Her voice was soft, her words heavy with meaning. Angela accepted the plate, her smile never wavering. "Thank you," she said simply. Margaret glanced around, her eyes landing on Daniel. He gave her a polite nod, his expression kind but measured. Margaret nodded back, then slowly made her way into the crowd. As the night went on, Margaret lingered on the edges, quietly watching the laughter and camaraderie around her. She didn't say much, but when Mrs. Carter offered her a cup of cider, she accepted with a small, grateful smile. The first snowflakes began to fall just as the block party was winding down. Neighbors lingered, reluctant to leave, their voices growing softer as the night deepened. Daniel and Angela stood together, their hands intertwined, watching the scene unfold. Mia ran up to them, her cheeks pink from the cold. "This is the best Christmas ever," she declared, her eyes shining with happiness. Angela laughed, pulling her daughter into a hug. "It really is, isn't it?" Daniel looked out at the neighborhood, now a true community. Families mingled, kids played, and even Margaret stood nearby, chatting with Mrs. Peterson. "Her son. This," he said softly, his voice filled with quiet pride, "is what home is supposed to feel like." Angela squeezed his hand, her heart full. As the snow fell gently around them, the Johnsons stood together, surrounded by love, laughter, and the bright light of hope.